G'day, and welcome to this Cycling Life Bytes. In this short episode, what I'm going to talk to you through is how to set a training goal and then how to break that training goal down into an overall plan. It's a topic that we talked about on episode one of our This Cycling Life webinar, but we didn't go into too much detail, so I'm going to give you a little bit more information now. So let's first start with kind of the big picture. So, you're an athlete, you're a Masters athlete, you're looking forward to next year's season or even beyond, and you're thinking about how do I sort of break down my goals, my ambitions into more achievable bites. So the first thing to keep in mind here actually is that we have essentially three sort of phases or cycles, if you like, of training towards a goal. So the first one is what we can call a macro cycle. So for me, as a Masters athlete, of course, I'm a huge fan of the World Masters Games, which happens every 4 years. If you haven't heard of it, it's essentially an Olympics for old people like us. So it's for Masters athletes, and it's not just cycling. I think 23 different sports in New Zealand, which was the last one in 2017, road cycling, mountain biking, track cycling. I competed at the World Masters in Torino in Italy 2013. I took away a bronze medal, which was a huge achievement for me. The next one's coming in 2021 in Japan. That's next year, and I've been preparing that as part of my overall training plans and goals. So that can be a macro cycle. Now, of course, if you're a professional athlete or an elite athlete, that would be the Olympics. For older people like us, that macro longer kind of goal could be something like a World Masters. However, for many of us, we're typically looking at goals more within sort of a 1 year time horizon. So we're looking towards the next season or the next summer. And that, so sometimes that's sort of the 1 year goal. For me, as a Masters athlete, I typically work on a 6-month macro cycle. The reason for that is I try to have 2 peaks during any given season. So I typically try to peak in the early spring, and then I tend to head for another peak towards the sort of late summer, early autumn. Now, there's a reason for that, is because I'm professionally, what I do for a job, I do a lot of keynote speaking, conference and event speaking. So what I also try to do is I essentially build my peaks, my competitiveness around the demands of my job, because the busiest periods for me professionally are from around middle of April until June. That's the conference and event season. And then from middle of September and through till around the end of October, that's also quite a busy period for me professionally. So I need to make some money in those times. So I build my season kind of around that. What we're then talking about is what we call a mesocycle, and that's essentially breaking down. There's that 6-month goal. How do we now to break that down into phases of training to make sure that by the end of March, early April, I'm really flying, I'm in peak condition. So that's what we call the mesocycle, where we're breaking things down into blocks of 2 weeks, up to 10 weeks, where we're really developing specific, physiological systems, and where we're sort of developing, going from a base into more specific training. I'll talk about that. And what we also talk about here is what we call the microcycle. And that's actually really when you're breaking your training down into those day-to-day plans. And I will get into more detail there as well. So let me show you here kind of the big picture. Don't be freaked out by this. It looks a little bit complicated when you see it. It's not. I'll talk you through the principles. So here's what we would typically look at as an overall training cycle. Now, you see what I've done is actually sort of designed this in alignment with what I just explained to you, which is building up for a peak to me typically in that late March, April period. This year, that would have been for me the UCI Granfondo World Series race in Cyprus, the Tour of Cyprus. That would have been a time trial on the Friday and then 2 road stages. Not so long, I think around 90 kilometers for the Saturday stage, around 70 or less kilometers for the Sunday stage. Also good for me because I don't have a huge amount of hours to train, with work being quite busy at the moment. The other race that I was then aiming for was the Giro Sardinia at the end of April. It's a fantastic event. Please go away and have a look at it. A 6-day race on the island of Sardinia in Italy, and that's a little bit of everything. You have flat stages for the sprinters, hilly stages for the punchy guys like me. You've got a couple of climbing stages, and you've got a time trial as well. I absolutely love it because it's about as close to pro cycling as you can get. Now, the nice thing about the Giro Sardinia is also they have 2 parallel races, what's called the Grand Giro which has much longer stages, like road stages up to like 150 kilometers. Then they have the Medio Giro, which is with road stages up to around 90 kilometers. So for me this year, again, because of kind of work being a little bit busy, I was going to go for the Medio Giro, that race with the slightly shorter stages. So that would have been my sort of two peaks. So that would have been competitive for me towards end of March and carrying into April. However, of course, it doesn't start there, it starts back. So if you look back in the map there, you go back to November, December, you see there that there is what we call this build phase. Alan talked us through that during episode 2 of this Cycling Life webinar. That's the gym work, the core work, the plyometrics. That's really laying the foundation, putting that foundation on the house to be ready to build upon that later in the season. Very important. And for us, that's a period of about 10 to 12 weeks. What you would then see there is you're moving into what's called a more specific phase. The specific phase there is starting now to shift from, say, the gym to the on-bike power training. So Alan always, gives me these workouts like seated power. You just sit on your bike, usually for me, an indoor trainer, or if you've got a nice, steady climb. And what you're doing there is low cadence, relatively high power, just under threshold. So cadence of 45, 50. And that's kind of like doing, leg squats on the bike. It's building power, building strength. It's building muscle fibers, because it really is that sort of effort where you're working on muscular endurance, but also you're building bone density there, because you're pushing a higher gear. You're putting stress not just on your muscles, but also on your skeletal system. All good stuff, right? So we're moving there into more specific stuff. Now, also what I'll probably start introducing here are rides on my time trial bike, just to get myself into that position, because physiologically, the way that your body is positioned on the bike is different. The pressure it puts on your diaphragm when you're leaning forward. So you're starting to introduce some more of these specific trainings along the way as well. What we're then moving into, typically by late January, February, is now we're starting to get into really priming the engine. There's a reason in the build and specific phase I haven't been doing a lot of very high lactate work. Now, the reason for that, of course, is that I want to build actually muscle hypertrophy. I want my muscles to grow. I want to stimulate the mitochondria, the cells in my muscles. And what the research shows is if you do too much of this sort of HIIT training or very high lactate training, lactic acid actually destroys mitochondria, or it inhibits mitochondrial development. You don't want that during that early phase. So that's why, we're not doing we're doing intensity, we're doing the gym work, the squats, the plyometrics, but we're not doing so much of the kind of, threshold, longer intervals of 5-10 minutes, which is flooding your body with lactate, because actually, as we said, that can be detrimental to your mitochondria. You don't want that. However, in this phase, in the pre-competitive phase, we're moving now into more of that sort of HIIT training, putting the stresses on the body that you need to do to get your body primed for competition. So these will be the micro intervals, the threshold HIIT workouts and stuff like that. The other thing that becomes important here is this. I work on what's called a polarized training program. We're going to talk more about that later. But what that says essentially is that I'm doing a lot of very easy kilometers, and then I'm doing more high intensity work, whether that's in the gym or it's the plyometrics, or now getting into the pre-competitive phase, it's something like micro intervals. What that has meant, however, is that I haven't been doing very much what would be called sweet spot or tempo work, in that sort of heart rate zone 3 and zone 4. When you're in a race and you're with the peloton and you're moving along, right? That's not zone 1 or 2. That's going to be, for me, a heart rate maybe of 150, 155. We're doing 40 kilometers an hour. I'm sitting in the bunch. I'm doing a wattage for me, probably in that bunch of maybe 250, 260 watts, just to stay in the bunch. But I haven't done much of that work because I've been working on this more polarized, very easy combined with higher intensity. So what I also need to do during this pre-competitive phase is get my body ready to, to ride at 90, 2 hours, 2.5 hours. This is typically the length of Masters racing, right? I'm not racing for 6 hours. So in the World Series race in Casablanca, which I did back in January, that race was 2 hours and 40 minutes. I absolutely was not ready for that. I managed to get on the podium, which was a surprise for me. But actually, I hadn't done this sort of more endurance tempo kind of work leading into Casablanca, because that hadn't fitted with my plan. In Casablanca, I was more oriented towards the time trial. I survived it, but it wasn't easy. I was cramping and everything. So actually what we're doing here in this pre-competitive phase is, for me, maybe 3 weeks before, when I'm doing these longer stage races or longer events of 2.5 hours, 3 hours, what I need to be doing then in the pre-competitive phase is getting my body used to that. So I will, do some races, and not racing to win, but just racing to sit in the peloton, get my body used to doing this sort of zone 4 work, heart rate up, pushing the power, because if you haven't done it in training, you're not likely to do it in the race, as Mick Rogers says. And the risk there is your body's not ready. It's a shock. So you don't have to do a lot of it, however. So typically, for me, I might do just 2 or 3 days where I put my body under that stress of doing 2.5 hours at normalized power of around 250 to 260 watts. And then my body suddenly gets it, right? Jamie's going to put you under this pressure, body, so you better get ready for that. The mistake that a lot of people make is they do far, far too much of that kind of zone 3, zone 4 work already back in the build and specific phase. Now, what's happening there, your body is producing lactate. You don't really feel very fatigued, but you're producing lactate. And you don't want that because, as we said, you need that mitochondrial response, right? So for me, I'm only really introducing that more high intensity endurance work relatively close to the competitive day as well. So what I'm actually describing to you now, if you look down, are these mesocycles, right? I'm talking about how I'm moving from gym work, core work, plyometrics into on-bike power training. So that's moving from one mesophase to another mesophase. And you'll see that what I'm also explaining to, if you look below that, is essentially I'm also, hinting to you about these individual training sessions that I'm doing, the seated power, the micro intervals. And we're going to explain more about what those things are in later episodes. We tell you exactly what a micro interval protocol involves. But as I said, I'm sticking here to the big picture, so you see that below in those microcycles, right? So what you'll also see there is in the competitive phase, it's a pretty long stretch. I'm going from sort of late March through to end of April. It's about 4 weeks where I'll be in really good form. So I do Cyprus, but then what I'll do is, if you look in that competitive phase, look below it, there's essentially these 3 little meso blocks. The middle block will be a period where I come out of Cyprus in really top form. I need to rest my body a little bit, and then I get back into what I would call the kind of pre-competitive mesocycle again, because then I'm tweaking and refining my training to head to the Giro Sardinia. So again, look below that level. When you look at the microcycles, what I'll be doing there, here comes Giro Sardinia. There's going to be a time trial. I'll be doing those individual time trial sessions. There's going to be some flat stages. I'm a good sprinter, so I'm going to be doing my standing start efforts, my sprint training, more so than I would do for Cyprus, because in Cyprus, it's more mountainous and not so likely to end in a bunch sprint. Also, what I'll be doing there for Sardinia is really now doing a little bit more racing, because I've also got to get used to just being in that big peloton again. In Sardinia, there can be 150, 160 guys in the peloton. So I do racing here in Belgium, where I put my body and my mind into that intensive experience of racing very closely with the guys in the peloton. So that's where I would be. Then the end of April, Giro Sardinia is done. And then I'd be going more again into what we call transition, which is the rest phase. Now, of course, this is also for me getting back to work, right? Because for me, as I said, from that period, late April through May and June, I'm going to be on the road giving keynote speeches in Oslo or Budapest or wherever. So I'm more likely to be using gym bikes and, stuff like that. So I have a bit of a rest period. Then the cycle starts again. Okay, so from as I said, sort of June into July, what I'm doing there is basically resetting the button. I don't go right back to the build phase as intensively as I do in the winter. I've already got that. So typically that build phase in the second half of the year will be a bit shorter, a couple of weeks in the gym, plyometrics, that kind of stuff. Then I'm getting back into specifics, and then I'm ready again by the end of, well, probably by late August, but certainly middle of September, I should be flying again. So that's the big picture, folks. I hope that that makes sense to you. I'll stop the share at that point. So that's it. So you've got your goal. You break your goal down into these phases. Okay. macro goal into the mesophases. The mesophases then get broken down into the microcycles, which are these individual day-by-day training sessions. And as I said, for me, that involves 2 cycles in a year. Now, actually, what I do is not all that different to what you would see, the pro cyclists do. So if you think of someone like Alaphilippe or Philippe Gilbert, what do you see with those guys? They tend to have a peak in the spring, just like me, late March, April, spring classics. Then what they do is they've got to recover from that intense period of competition and, training. So what you then see is they generally have this, transition phase. And then they start building up again for another peak. It may be the Tour de France for an Alaphilippe. It may be a World Championships for a Philippe Gilbert. So with the pros, you see typically they're having these 2 kind of peaks during the year, which is similar to me. I'm a bit different. I'm a guy with a job and a family. So as I said, my phases actually also are designed to make sure that I can juggle those 3 balls of career, family, and self. And work that around. The other thing, as I said, my level of ambition will vary year by year depending on how busy work is or how demanding my family commitments are. So that's why that macro cycle is very important, that 4-year horizon. So what I'm working on is typically, 1 in 4 is a really big year for me. So I had a big year in 2013. 2017, I had another big year. I didn't go off to the World Masters Games because my work was busy later in the year, but I had a cracking, spring right through summer there. I think 2017, I had 23 podiums for the year. But then 2018, 2019, I was back at work again. I had to earn money, make sure that my family is happy. And then this year, 2020, I'm back into a bigger cycle because I'm heading up towards the 2021 World Masters Games. So pretty much from October, November this year, I will step back from a lot of my work commitments and I'll be living like a pro for 6 months, getting ready for those World Masters in Japan, and then going on to the World UCI Masters next year as well. So I hope that makes sense, how I look at life in that sort of bigger picture, working on those longer cycles. But also what I do keep in mind is that life is long, and I absolutely intend to keep racing my bike for at least, I guess, the next 30 years. So that's a much bigger macro cycle for me because I'm looking on to competing on the road, on the track, well into the future. So I hope that all makes sense for you. I hope you've enjoyed this micro bite of This Cycling Life, and we look forward to keeping you as a friend of the series. So thanks for your time, thanks for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode.